Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first substantive lecture for American Government in 20. We're starting with Chapter 1, talking about power and citizenship. So let's take a step back and think about what do we mean when we talk about politics. One of the classic definitions from David Easton is that politics is who gets what, when, and how. So when we think about this, it really means how do the goods and services, but also the detriments of society, get distributed? And who decides it? So who decides whether or not a new bridge it gets built or it doesn't? Or how do we get from a demand for changes in police brutality to some sort of actual policy outcome? Politics is really about that power. But another way to think about politics is that it's a way in which we establish society, where we create a set of rules and norms collectively and explicitly. So a lot of our norms in society are implicit, right? No one probably told you whether or not you had to put on underwear this morning. There's just social norms around that. But we do have an explicit social norm that if you got in a car today, you needed to put on your seatbelt before you started driving. That's a social norm, but it's a social norm enforced by a law. And there were politics, a deciding process for how that came to be a law. So, thinking about that, do we have politics on our campus? We talk about politics as being a government thing, right? Government thing. But really, there are politics everywhere. What are the politics of campus? Well, let's talk more about that power. When we think about our politics on campus, who has the power? Well, we often see it as being in the hands maybe of administrators or professors. But when we apply this to government, power is generally perceived as being in the hands of elites, right? President Obama or members of Congress or the Supreme Court Justice, right? We think of Ruth Bader Ginsburg as powerful. But power really is the ability to get others to do what you want, right? There can be legitimate ways of doing this where someone acquiesces to your power, right? There's a power dynamic right here. I want you all to do homework. In wanting you to do homework, I am exercising power. Now, you could choose not to do your homework, and then my power doesn't work. But you hopefully see my demand for homework as legitimate, as part of your learning process. Alternatively, there are less legitimate ways of exercising power. We can all probably think of recent examples in, for example, Ferguson, or in Baltimore, or in New York, and the list goes on, of power being exercised via violence and force that is less legitimate. The government then can be understood as the organizing system for creating power and exercising authority over others. So it's the institutions plural, that we as a public decide gets to have power and decide that entity has legitimate power. Another way to think about this is also that then government has a legitimate monopoly on force, right? That we vote people into office in our case, right? With the idea that they're going to make decisions based on what we want. And in doing so, we devolve our power to them. So how do governments and other big institutions, like, for example, Xavier, how do they exercise power and demonstrate authority? Well, one of the main ways they do that is through rules, right? Setting guidelines. So there were rules about how you registered for classes and when you registered for classes. There are rules about when you have to pay your tuition. There are rules about what is and isn't acceptable classroom behavior, right? In the first welcome video, I briefly mentioned the academic dishonesty policy. That's a rule. Organizations are generally full of rules. They help create operating systems so that people know what to expect. these institutions are complex organizations that we'll talk a lot more about when we get to bureaucracy. So aside from the examples I mentioned, what would be some of the institutions that you see on campus or at your job or maybe in your church? And what are some of the rules that those institutions make in order to try and coerce behavior? And coerce isn't always negative. Or that try and provide some stability in how things should be. Now, this is still background, but it's very difficult to talk about politics and government without talking a little bit about economics. For those of you that have taken econ, 1030 or something else, this probably seems obvious. For those of you that haven't, maybe it seems less obvious. So what exactly is economics? Well, it's a big umbrella term that just means all of the ways in which goods and services are produced, bought, sold, consumed. It incorporates all of those things, right? And so the production and distribution of all of these resources and services and consumption of those resources and services are what creates our economy. Now, when we think about our liberal tradition, economics is seen as something private, but in practice, economics doesn't really perform well without some role for government. So what do governments need to do in order to regulate the economy? Think about it. Hold on to that question. We'll come back to it. So let's look at some of the different ways that's been interpreted. So an economic system that you're probably all familiar with is capitalism. So capitalism talks about the ideas of how things should be distributed, like all economic theories do. So who should be in control of the modes of production and the materials? Who should make decisions about how resources and services are distributed? In capitalism, it says the market. What is the market? The market is this idea, is really an idea. It's not a thing. So it's not like you're going to the French market when we talk about the market in capitalism. Instead, it's the idea that goods, services, products will be exchanged, that there are buyers and sellers who engage with each other in the process so that consumers can consume and producers can produce. In a capitalist system like the US, we think that capitalism should have some regulation, but depending on your ideology, you want more or less of that. What's interesting is that there's a pretty wide variety in what Americans in general think capitalism is. So if you had to explain capitalism to someone else, how would you do it? Would you need a diagram? Could you tell the person in front of you in line at Raising Cane's what capitalism is before it was your turn to order? Or is it a little bit more complex? Well, maybe it'll help if we juxtapose this with socialism, something that we hear a lot about often in criticism of Obama or of Democrats in general, or in reference to former governments like the USSR. So what is socialism or a socialist economy? Well, it's one where the state actually determines how those resources are distributed. So in capitalism, you have private entities making the decisions of what services will be offered, what gets produced, who produces it, and how. Under a socialist economy, the state has either an entire say in that, where everything is state-run, or has at least some influence. So we can think about places like Sweden, which is a socialist democracy. The state intervenes in the economy, but it doesn't fully control it. In contrast to somewhere like Cuba, where with the exception of a pretty strong black and gray markets, it's a socialist economy where the government is controlling everything. So American politicians often use this term socialist as a way to vilify one another. And I use the example of Obama. I'm sure you've heard that before. But who else have you heard called a socialist? Think about it. Take a minute to click on the link and check out the podcast, We Found a Socialist, and see if there are any people in politics now that currently sound like socialists. Like Bernie Sanders, one of the more recent Democratic presidential candidates to enter his hat into the ring. Is he a socialist? Or is he a capitalist with some socialist tendencies? So far, when we think about capitalism and socialism, I was presenting it really largely in a framework of democracies. That's what we're all familiar with because we live in a democracy. But not all countries are democracies. And it's helpful to understand the US system when we think about what are some of the alternatives. How is our system similar or different to alternative systems? So let's start with the ones that we're really the most different from. Right? Authoritarian systems where the state holds all the power. This could be in the form of a single individual, like a monarch. So North Korea, right, has a supreme leader and is an authoritarian state. It can also take the form of a theocracy, a government that claims all of its power from a religious authority, right? The Ayatollah in Iran is a great example. Authoritarian regimes can also take the form of what's called a military junta, where you have a group generally of generals or military elites who are in charge. We saw that for a little while in Egypt, and it seems to come around perennially in Turkey. We also then can differentiate within authoritarian systems ones that are fascist, so where the orientation is towards the state being almost like a religion, right? We can think of Nazi Germany as one example, but again, North Korea would apply here, where everyone has to have allegiance not just to the leader, but to the state as a concept, like it's a religion. Oligarchy, which is like a military junta, except it's not the military. So where you have a group of elites running things who might not be generals, they might be economic elites as opposed to military elites. Now, I've been using North Korea as an example here throughout authoritarianism, but we would maybe more accurately call it totalitarian. So what's the distinction? What differentiates a totalitarian regime from an authoritarian regime? Well, totalitarian regimes exercise all control. And this means that they control not just your public life, but also your private life. Imagine a government that tells you what kinds of clothes you can wear every day. That's totalitarian versus an authoritarian, which just places limits, but generally pretty strong limits. Now, that's one end of the spectrum, right? The other end of the spectrum is anarchy. So we have totalitarianism, where the government controls everything, to anarchy, where there just is no government. And sometimes it sounds like that's what's being advocated for when we hear libertarian or Tea Party candidates. But are they really interested in no government, in true anarchy, or just limited government? And what's the difference? Somewhere in the middle, right, between totalitarianism and anarchy is democracy, where the government is invested with power by the people based on popular sovereignty, right? So the idea of popular sovereignty is what I talked about at the beginning of this video, that we as the people give power to a subset of our population, to a set of institutions. And in turn, that means we have some say in our rulemaking. It also means that our government is typically limited. It doesn't control absolutely everything we do. Now, not all democracies are created equal. Elite democracies are ones in which it's really only the most powerful people in the country that can control what's going on, versus a pluralist democracy where it's really organizations of citizens, like interest groups, are really who controls things. A participatory democracy, on the other hand, is one in which the primary way of controlling the government is through a universal mechanism like suffrage. the right to vote. So you can think of this as being like a pyramid, right? At the top of our model of democracy, or where the fewest people are really influencing things, that's elite democracy. In the middle is pluralist democracy, where it's organizations who have a primary say, but organizations typically have elites within them. So it's a little bit like elite democracy, but with the people who organize into interest groups coming in and providing some commentary or helping shape what the leaders say we want. We'll come back to that when we talk about interest groups later this semester. The last, participatory democracy, that's going to be at the bottom of our hierarchy, or our model of democracy. And it's the one where we have the most people involved. Now, under each of these systems, the role of the people is different. In authoritarian systems, people are just subjects, right? You're obligated to take orders. You can think of it as if the entire government, the entire society, and all the citizens are sort of like members of the military during boot camp, right? Not a lot of autonomy. You don't really have a say. You just have to submit to government authority. You might have no rights. You might have a few rights, but regardless, you have to submit to authority. In a democratic system, we typically think of individuals as citizens, right? As members of the political community and as actively engaged in creating and recreating the institutions of government. So if on authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, individuals are subjects, and in democracies and socialist democracies, individuals are citizens, what are they in anarchies? So think about this a little bit further. What are the rights that come with our citizenship? And how do those rights balance with responsibilities? In order to get the rights of my citizenship, are there certain things that I have to do, or are there things that I just ought to do in order to be a part of the United States of America? And how do we differentiate between what is a right and what is a responsibility? So for example, is voting a right or a responsibility, or somehow both? Think about it. You may have already seen parts of this. In fact, most of you have heard the quote, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." Take a minute and watch the whole inaugural address. It's not that long. And you'll see how our former president, John F. Kennedy, understood this idea of rights and responsibilities as understood through citizenship. Okay, so quick learning check at the end of this. Can you define power if I were to come up and ask you? If someone in McDonald's said, "What's politics?" Could you explain it? How about an alien from Mars says, "What are these institutions?" Could you explain government to them and point to some different types of governments? So check those. If you're not real comfortable with those key concepts, maybe watch this again or go back to the book. See how things are going. Do a quick check with a friend. Do you know the different political and economic systems? What are the ones that we just covered? And what's in the book? And think about that last question I offered. How is citizenship different in each of these systems? What does it mean? What are the rights? What are the responsibilities?